Chapter 15 Crisis. The morning of July 8th, 1998, began for me the same way as any other workday would. Up at 7:30, get dressed, eat breakfast, make the 5-minute drive to work, and punch in by 8 o'clock. But this day would end in a much different way. About an hour after getting to work, a fellow employee approached me and said, "Your wife called and she needs you at home." When I inquired about the nature of this phone call, he replied even louder and more emphatically, "Get your ass home now." A wave of panic washed over my entire body as I ran to my car. The ride home was valuable in that it gave me a little time to gather my thoughts and tune into God's much-needed, calming influence. I pulled into my driveway with a new mindset, feeling strong, fortified, and ready for anything. I can't remember a time in my life when I felt so composed under such extreme duress. What happened on that morning was, when my wife went to wake up our daughter, she found that her body was limp and lifeless. She picked her up and held her, trying to get some kind of response. When it became clear to her that something was seriously wrong, she immediately called 911. What my daughter had experienced was a mild seizure. I arrived home a few minutes after the ambulance and paramedics, who soon whisked her away to a nearby hospital. She quickly recovered from her seizure, and after some tests, we were all on our way home. When we got home, my wife and I cried our eyes out as our daughter talked and played as if nothing had happened. That night, I thanked God deeply for helping my wife and I get through what had been the worst day of our lives. To get that kind of help and reinforcement, the moment it was needed, was simply amazing. This was clearly one of those times when the spiritual rubber meets the human road. There would be many instances in the years to come, hundreds, perhaps thousands, where I would go to God for help and support, and not once did God let me down. Not one single time. But that is just what you'd expect from someone who is totally dedicated and committed to serving you. After my daughter's seizure, the doctors put her on a drug called phenobarbital to prevent any further seizure activity. When a battery of tests and scans found nothing obviously wrong, we began to slowly wean her off this medication. For a time, it looked like her seizure would be a one-time phenomenon. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be the case. Chapter 16 Crisis of a Different Kind. As my family and I rang in the new year, and with my daughter's seizure seemingly behind us, my wife and I started planning to have another child. We were all at a great point in our lives, yet I found myself going through a different kind of crisis, a spiritual one. Not with my own relationship with God, but what I wasn't doing as far as helping other people spiritually. I have this genuine love for people, coupled with a strong desire to help people by sharing with them all that I know about God. Yet I was doing little to nothing with this desire. If you had the cure for cancer, or in this case, the cure for the broken soul, how long could you keep it to yourself? Something had to give. Every day I would talk at length with people who were broken or maybe even slightly cracked. I would meet people that were in need of love, support, wisdom, and guidance, people in need of friendship and companionship. These are all the things that God is giving to every one of us, every second of our lives, in spades. Or I would talk with folks who were sad and lonely, or struggling with addiction, or perhaps they had just lost a loved one, or someone with anger issues, or someone dealing with anxiety and depression. The list goes on and on and on, and I would always walk away from those conversations wishing I could do more for them. And I found myself thinking more and more, if they only knew God, what a difference it would make. I would turn on the nightly news, only to learn about the latest mass shooting, or another case of domestic violence, of murder, of rape, or of child abuse. Not to mention all the racism, sexism, homophobia, greed, fraud, waste, abuse, discrimination, corruption, and thievery that happens every second of every day. The list seemed endless. I'd look at history with all its conflicts, and the death, so much of it ironically in the name of God, and destruction they produced, the terror and oppression, genocide and ethnic cleansing, sectarian violence, and on and on and on. It was just plain horrifying, and the more I learned about these tragedies, the more driven I became to do something about it. But I wanted to do more than pray for people, keep them in my thoughts, or just hope that they would eventually be all right. I wanted to empower people spiritually. I desired to help people find the remedy for themselves by tapping into this original source of all things good, personally and individually, and help them reap directly the many immense benefits that knowing God can provide firsthand. The only questions were when, where, and how. In June, my wife, who was now 5 months pregnant with our second child, my daughter and myself took a trip to California to attend the high school graduation of a young woman my wife used to babysit for. During our visit, my daughter suffered a second seizure. Although she recovered from that episode, a dark cloud of worry and uncertainty hung over us for the rest of our time in California. When we got back to New England, my daughter was put back on daily medication and was soon diagnosed with epilepsy. My wife and I had a feeling that my daughter's health would be a very long and challenging road for many years to come. Chapter 17. The Turning Point. Going back to when I first found God, I had dreamt of ways of sharing my discovery with others. The problem had always been that I lacked the knowledge, confidence, and seasoning needed to accurately put into words, spoken or written, the experience of knowing and working with God. But by the late 90s, after going through so much in my own personal life and knowing God to the degree I did, I felt I had finally acquired enough wisdom and life experience necessary to become a real bona fide teacher or mentor of spiritual truth. One of the things I discovered over the years was that while most people believed in a God or some quote-unquote higher power, what they did with that belief was put it in a very small box and place it in the way back of their mind, only to bring to the forefront of their thinking occasionally, mostly in crisis situations. That kind of belief is hardly the immense, full-blown, everyday working partnership that I knew without a doubt it could be. For 15 years I had known God intimately and benefited greatly from His timeless wisdom and loving influence, literally thousands of times. My relationship with God had reaped endless spiritual fruit that I could apply to my marriage, my job, raising a child, dealing with my family, and on and on. It was incredible. And although I felt like I was ready and had the ability to start teaching people, I still had no idea as to how to go about actually doing it, or where I would be doing it. More importantly, could I muster up the courage to do this work without training, without a formal religious education, relying solely on my living experience both with and without God? And my final question of myself, could I muster up the courage and audacity to proclaim to people, "And these truths I know, for these truths I live"? How did I know? In thinking about what I would actually be teaching people, I knew I just didn't want to simply parrot, repeat, or regurgitate what someone else had told me or something I had read somewhere. It would have to be original. Now that's not in any way me trying to devalue or diminish the importance of speech and text, teachers and books. I am writing this book and you are reading it. And a person can gain a great deal of knowledge and understanding from textbooks and classroom-based learning, but at some point you have to get outside and get your hands dirty. You must get out, live life, and engage with the world, or in other words, become streetwise. My goal would have to be to formulate teachings that would be based exclusively on my life experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and my spiritual experiences of working with God personally and intimately. Besides, this was all I knew. And with this knowledge, my objective as a teacher would be, and will always be, to guide a person beyond the realm of academic study, tradition, and ritual, all the way to the real living experience of God, who just happens to be a real living being. On October 20th, 1999, my wife gave birth to a healthy baby girl, and we named her Olivia Ann Smith. Although our oldest was now 3 years old and becoming more independent, with our new arrival we felt like we were starting all over again, which of course we were. There was almost immediate tension between my wife and I, caused by a lack of sleep, as well as being on constant alert and all the other stresses that newborn babies can create. I felt right away that this would have to be our last child. I expressed this to my wife, who was understandably less than pleased with my ultimatum. I personally had a very hard time with the newborn and infant stages of parenting, so much so that I found myself looking forward to Mondays so I could get back to work and away from the laborious task of catering to an infant child. I knew I didn't possess the patience and stamina it would have taken to go through this a third time, and was not about to push the envelope. Although money was certainly an issue, this was more about a wise person realizing his limitations, which is crucial in trying to live a balanced and healthy life. In the end, I truly believe that having another child would have been the straw that broke the camel's back, both emotionally and financially. Within a couple of months after Olivia was born, my wife and I settled into a peaceful groove, and with the new millennium approaching, life was looking pretty good. As we got closer to the new year, I found myself chomping at the bit to get started with my new endeavor of working with people spiritually. As I was searching for ways to reach people, I happened to drive by a hand-painted and very amateurish-looking sign that simply read, "Advice by Perry." Now mind you, this Perry on the sign was an actual certified psychiatrist, but it gave me an idea. Make yourself available to people who are seeking spiritual advice. I thought about making up business cards with my contact information on them. From there, people could meet with me somewhere or we could talk on the telephone. A friend of mine also suggested using a personal computer and the web for their online chat rooms and message boards as another way to reach people who might be spiritually hungry. These online chat rooms would become the ideal venue for me because it gave me access to a whole world of different people with different ideas, and more importantly, I wouldn't have to leave the house. This was something I could do at midnight or 3 o'clock in the morning when the whole house was asleep. The one thing I was adamant about was not letting my new passion interfere with my family life. I began thinking if I could do something with people along the lines of what my friend did with me, the one-on-one person-to-person conversation we had the night I found God, it should be effective in helping the people I'd be working with to find and experience God for themselves. I immediately got online and began to look for religious chat rooms to gain practical experience in discussing God with others. My work as a teacher of spiritual truth began on January 1st, 2000. My thinking was that the new millennium would naturally raise the overall level of human awareness, and people would be hungry for a new kind of spiritual awakening. My deepest dream was, and still is, to revolutionize the way people think about and approach God, and to usher in a golden age of spiritual enlightenment that is finally rooted in true spirituality, which I define as, once again, knowing and working with God on a first-hand, individual, personal, and intimate level. My avenue for accomplishing this awakening would be by formulating teachings based primarily on the similarities between the God experience and the positive human experience, drawing on the parallels between the two. Firstly, because the same relationship principles apply, and secondly, because it is a truth that most human beings can relate to. I hope that this golden age of enlightenment will promote a gradual shift from doctrine study and rote exercise to a real, robust, active, personal, dynamic relationship with the Supreme Creator himself, the likes of which has yet to be seen on our planet. Chapter 18. Depression. Life at home was becoming increasingly stressful and tense as my wife and I seemed to constantly be at odds. I had the relatively easy job of driving around by myself delivering auto supplies, while she labored hard at our home with our two young children. Like most mothers, she was overworked, underpaid, and underappreciated. She even took on the additional task of watching our niece and nephew. And our oldest daughter, Susanna, suffered another seizure on the 14th of February. When you add this to breastfeeding a baby, sleep deprivation, overall self-neglect, a child with epilepsy, and a husband who could have been a lot more attentive, you have all the ingredients for real clinical depression. That spring, I was working 2 nights a week to supplement our income. Tensions between my wife and I came to a head when, after a night at work, I came home to find both my wife and our youngest daughter in tears. My attempt to intervene led to an argument that resulted in my losing my composure and calling my wife probably the worst 4-letter word a man could call a woman. With that one word, I had instantly tore her heart out as well as my own, and she came within an inch of asking me to leave our home. Our relationship was at an all-time low, and it would be quite some time until we would be whole again. As I was spending most of my free time trying to help people spiritually, unbeknownst to me, my wife was slowly descending into the abyss of depression. The seriousness of real depression was foreign to me. I knew my wife was down, but not to the extent that she truly was. My thinking was that it would soon pass and she would be back to her normal, happy self, but her pain was too deep and it was becoming all-consuming. It can make you feel helpless at times because you realize that while your cooperation and support is essential, you can't go inside a person's mind and find peace, happiness, and satisfaction for them. Despite all these challenges, my primary goals were to simply be there for her, help out around the house as much as possible, and lastly, never to lose my composure again. It was a time when, once again, working with God on a daily and sometimes hourly basis was critical in getting me through these extremely difficult times. Chapter 19. The Chat Room Years. My Education. One of the few bright spots for me during these rather hard and difficult times was getting my feet wet talking about God in online chat rooms. My initial experience online was finding rooms that were anti-God or anti-religion, where I would try to convince people of God's existence, while they would try to convince me of God's non-existence. From their perspective, I was pushing a fairy tale on them, and from mine, it was like telling me that water isn't wet, the sky isn't blue, or I didn't love my children. At the end of the day, my bold effort was an abject failure for one very good and timeless reason. The people in these rooms weren't seeking God. It was a strong lesson for me in regards to who I should be sharing this truth with. I mean, if the stone-cold fact of one's own existence itself hasn't convinced them, if this vast planet teeming with life that we all reside on hasn't convinced them, if they can look up at the night sky with its millions of stars and galaxies and not think that there is a God, a creator, then tell me, what words could I possibly say to a person that would suddenly bring them to the realization that there truly is a God? Without God, there would be nothingness, and you can't open your eyes anywhere without seeing something. Without a creator, there would be no creation. But still, if that person was just as immovable in his or her feelings about God as I was, no one was going to budge. And it started becoming not only a waste of time, but also an exercise in futility. It was also annoying to those people that simply weren't interested in hearing about God. In the end, it did help me learn one very valuable lesson. Sharing spiritual truth is like giving someone advice. You give it when you are asked for it.